Right now, in the Persian Gulf, there are roughly 23,000 innocent commercial sailors.
Yeah, just stranded out there on the water.
Literally stranded on cargo ships. I mean, they are running out of fresh water, their food supplies are dwindling,
Right.
and they are essentially being held hostage by fleets of, well, glorified, heavily armed speedboats.
It's completely wild to see.
It is. And then, at the exact same time, if you look across the globe over in the United States, teenagers are being ushered out of math and history classes.
Yeah, put onto buses funded by taxpayer dollars.
Exactly. Driven to anti-government protests. And, on paper, a maritime standoff in the Middle East and a high school field trip in Chicago, they have absolutely nothing to do with each other.
Right, they seem totally disconnected.
But if you look at the underlying mechanics of how our world operates today, they are actually symptoms of the exact same disease.
They really are. It is the absolute breakdown of the rules. I mean, the whole architecture that we've all been living inside for, the last 80 years, it's just collapsing.
Welcome to today's morning roundup. If you've been feeling like the ground is shifting under your feet lately, you are definitely not alone.
Absolutely not alone.
We've got a massive stack of briefings, articles, and cultural critiques in front of us today, and we're going everywhere in this deep dive.
We really are covering the map today.
Yeah, we're looking at asymmetric naval warfare, far-right nationalist philosophy, deep state intelligence networks, far-left domestic policy, and, ancient theology.
It's a lot.
It is a lot. And just to set the ground rules for today's deep dive right up front, we are dealing with highly radioactive, polarizing material here.
Very politically charged.
Extremely. We've got extreme left-wing strategy and extreme right-wing ideology on the table today, so we are not here to endorse any of it.
Right. Our goal isn't to take sides.
Not at all. We are not telling you who the good guys or the bad guys are. Our job is to just give every single one of these ideas a totally fair shake.
Yeah, by basically popping the hood, looking at the engine, and showing you exactly how these vastly different worldviews operate.
Exactly, because if we want to understand the chaos, we have to understand the people driving it.
And when you lay all these disparate materials out side by side, a very clear narrative through line actually emerges.
Which is what?
We are watching, like in real time, the death of the post-war secular consensus.
Okay, wait. Let's unpack that term before we go any further, because it sounds like something you'd hear in, like, a graduate seminar.
Yeah, it does sound a bit academic.
But it actually affects how much we pay for groceries.
Right.
And what our kids learn in school. So when you say the post-war secular consensus, what exactly was the deal we all signed up for?
Right, so think back to the end of the Second World War. The globe was basically in ruins.
Total devastation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the victorious powers, led primarily by the United States, they built a new operating system for the world.
Like a reset.
Yeah, and it was built on a series of neat, rational agreements. We created the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF.
Right.
We established clear rules for international trade, rules for maritime navigation, and rules for warfare. And then domestically?
Domestically, it was a consensus that rational secularism, science, and liberal democratic institutions could effectively govern society.
Exactly. We basically agreed to trust the experts, trust the borders, and trust the institutions.
It was a horizontal, engineered system.
Yes, it promised stability. But, the defining feature of every single piece of material we are analyzing today is that people no longer believe in that system.
The rules are fracturing.
Fracturing completely. And society isn't just looking to, tweak the tax code in response. They are actively scrambling to replace that dying consensus with frameworks that are deeper, older, and significantly more radical.
Wow. And if you want to see that post-war consensus literally taking on water, we have to start on the physical map.
Yeah, out on the actual ocean.
Right. Let's look at the literal battle for the globe's waterways. We've got a detailed briefing on what's currently happening in the Strait of Hormuz.
Under what the U.S. is calling Project Freedom.
Project Freedom. And this is just a textbook example of the old order fighting for its life.
It really is. I mean, the Strait of Hormuz is a fundamental artery of global commerce.
Like a quarter of the world's oil trade passes through this narrow choke point.
Right, alongside massive volumes of fertilizer and agricultural goods.
And right now, Iran has essentially dropped a toll booth in the middle of international waters.
Yeah.
And the human cost here is staggering. I mean, we mentioned the 23,000 civilians from 87 different countries stranded out there.
From 87 different countries.
Right. These are just guys trying to do their jobs on commercial freighters. And at least 10 sailors have already died.
It's awful. The briefing describes them as sitting ducks for Iranian piracy.
But what I find fascinating looking at the sources is the economic self-mutilation involved here.
Oh, yeah, the blowback on Iran itself is severe.
Severe is putting it mildly, I think. The data indicates this blockade is costing Iran up to $500 million a day in lost revenue.
500 million a day.
A day. Their domestic inflation is hitting 70%. The currency is an absolute freefall.
So structurally, it makes zero economic sense.
Zero. But they are holding the line, right? Demanding tolls and using explosives against commercial ships that refuse to comply.
Because they are prioritizing an ideological commitment over pure economic rationality.
Which is?
The disruption of the Western-led order. And this is a recurring theme we'll see today. They don't care about the money. They want to break the system.
And in response, the United States is deploying massive, highly sophisticated assets to defend the old rules.
We're talking Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers.
Over 100 land and sea-based aircraft.
And 15,000 service members just to establish a protective bubble.
But let's look at the actual mechanics of this naval standoff, because this is where the post-war assumptions really break down. The U.S. military is explicitly operating in a defensive posture.
Right. They are only firing if fired upon.
But they've already sunk 7 Iranian fast boats. Now, when you read the tactical breakdown of these fast boats, it's wild. It's not ship-to-ship combat like, the Battle of Midway.
No, not at all.
The Iranian Revolutionary Guard uses these small, cheap vessels. They look like heavily modified Boston whalers.
Yeah, just little fiberglass boats.
And they employ swarm tactics.
It's the absolute definition of asymmetric warfare.
Exactly. You have a U.S. destroyer that costs roughly $2 billion.
$2 billion.
Armed with SM-2 interceptor missiles that cost over $2 million a pop.
Yeah.
And they are being harassed by a fiberglass speedboat with a machine gun and a cheap anti-ship rocket bolted to the deck.
The cost-exchange ratio there is a nightmare for the U.S.
A total nightmare. I mean, a swarm of 50 fast boats scattering on radar creates immense clutter. Even if the U.S. sinks 7, the sheer math of the threat remains.
And that gets to the absolute core of why the United States is committing such massive resources to this, despite the horrific cost-to-benefit ratio on a tactical level.
Right. Why do it?
If we look at the geopolitical mechanics, the U.S. is desperately trying to maintain the foundational norm of the post-war world.
Freedom of navigation.
Exactly. The bedrock assumption that international waters are open for the free flow of goods.
Because if Iran successfully establishes that a single nation can claim an international shipping lane and violently charge a toll without being completely wiped off the map, the precedent is set.
Right. The entire framework of global trade collapses. If Iran does it in Hormuz, China watches and applies it to the South China Sea.
Russia applies it to the Arctic.
Exactly. The U.S. isn't just protecting ships. They're attempting to physically enforce a global psychology.
But, while the U.S. Navy is trying to hold the physical map together with billion-dollar warships, there is a massive philosophical push to tear that exact map to shreds.
Oh, absolutely.
If we transition from the Persian Gulf to the realm of geopolitical theory, we run right into Alexander Dugin in our sources.
Right. Dugin is a vital figure to understand right now. He's a prominent Russian political philosopher, often characterized by Western analysts as a Rasputin-like influence on Vladimir Putin.
And the briefing we're looking at zeroes in on a very recent, highly publicized meltdown Dugin had on X.
Formerly Twitter, yeah.
Yeah, formerly Twitter. It was a late-night, just unhinged rant where he went on what can only be described as an anti-white crash-out.
Yeah, the phrasing was intense.
If you read the actual posts, he doesn't sound like a sophisticated geopolitical mastermind.
No, not at all.
He sounds like a bitter, drunk grandfather yelling at the TV in a pub. I mean, he called Europeans a self-hatred race with no reason to exist.
Blaming them entirely for the sins of liberalism, capitalism, and materialism.
Right. So to understand the mechanics of why Dugin is deploying this kind of vitriol, we have to understand the architecture he is trying to build, right?
Yes, Dugin is the primary architect of what he calls the fourth political theory.
Okay, let's unpack that. What were the first 3?
So according to Dugin, the modern era produced 3 great political theories: liberalism, communism, and fascism.
Okay.
In his view, fascism was defeated in 1945, and communism was defeated in 1991.
Leaving liberalism.
Leaving liberalism, which is the secular post-war consensus we've been discussing, as the sole dominant and ultimately toxic victor.
Right.
The fourth political theory is his attempt to construct an ideology specifically designed to destroy liberalism.
Destroy it completely. And what does that actually look like in practice?
It manifests as multipolarity.
Multipolarity.
Yeah. In Dugin's ideal multipolar world, the era of Western universalism is over. He doesn't want a single set of global rules enforced by the U.S. Navy.
Okay, so what does he want?
Instead, the globe would fracture into distinct, isolated civilizational blocks based on ancient traditions.
Like what?
Russia returns to deep Eastern Orthodoxy and Eurasianism. The Chinese bloc returns to Confucianism and the I Ching. The Islamic world operates on Sharia.
So they just exist in silos.
Right. The idea is that these regional spheres just exist independently, totally rejecting the universal human rights or economic models of the modern West.
Wait, hold on. Let me push back on that for a second, based on the material here, because structurally, that sounds completely unworkable.
Oh, it has massive flaws.
Right. If the world actually fractures into these isolated civilizational islands, how does the global economy function?
It wouldn't.
Like, if China is operating purely on ancient traditionalism and Russia is operating on mystical orthodoxy, how do they negotiate a trade deal for semiconductors or aerospace parts?
They don't.
Are we just pretending the 21st century supply chain doesn't exist? Because to me, multipolarity sounds less like a viable political theory and more like, I don't know, very expensive historical LRRPing.
That is the exact vulnerability of Dugin's model that the analysis points out. It's highly romanticized.
Yeah.
He is attempting to apply a metaphysical sledgehammer to a deeply interconnected physical reality. And Dugin claims to base all of this on a philosophical school called traditionalism,
Right.
specifically citing the early 20th century French philosopher René Guénon.
But the analysis we have here completely eviscerates Dugin's use of Guénon.
Yes, it does.
They argue Dugin is fundamentally distorting the philosophy to justify Russian nationalism.
Precisely. Guénon wrote extensively about the crisis of the modern world, the loss of spiritual hierarchy, and the emptiness of materialism.
But what did he actually advocate for?
Guénon was focused on inner spiritual transformation. He actually pointed toward Catholicism as the last remaining vessel for tradition in the West.
Right.
He eventually moved to Egypt, lived a quiet, ascetic life, and pursued inner spiritual order.
Which exposes a massive, glaring contradiction in Dugin. If true traditionalism is supposed to be about finding a higher spiritual order, surrendering your ego, and detaching from the frantic, materialist obsession with power.
How do you square that with his behavior?
Right. How do you square that with a guy acting like a drunken maniac on social media? You can't claim to be an enlightened ascetic while simultaneously screaming into Elon Musk's algorithm about how the West must be destroyed.
It completely reveals the underlying mechanism of Dugin's project.
Yeah.
The critique here is that Dugin is using the profound, quiet metaphysics of traditionalism as a hollow skin suit for his own virulent resentment.
A skin suit. That's a great way to put it.
The analysis compares him to a bitter Cold War soldier who never mentally accepted that the Soviet Union lost.
Oh, wow.
He claims to despise Western hegemony, but in reality, he is intensely jealous of it. He wants that power for Russia. It's a pursuit of dominance, not spiritual enlightenment.
So on one side of the globe, you have the U.S. Navy burning billions of dollars to physically hold the post-war consensus together. On the other side, you have figures like Dugin actively engineering ideologies to shatter that exact consensus into a multipolar free-for-all.
It's a huge collision.
And when the public watches these overarching, stabilizing structures fail so visibly, that paranoia doesn't just evaporate.
No, it trickles down.
It trickles down. When you realize the map is drawn in pencil and the lines are moving, you stop trusting the cartographers entirely.
The social contract of trust dissolves.
Right.
When the explicit rules of the world are challenged, the public begins looking for the implicit, hidden mechanics of power beneath the surface.
Which brings us to the shadowy underbelly of our deep dive today.
Intelligence, espionage, and the absolute collapse of institutional trust.
Nothing exemplifies this quite like the investigative analysis we have on the Jeffrey Epstein network.
Yeah, the Epstein case has morphed from a story of personal criminality into a foundational myth of modern institutional corruption.
The investigative reporting we're looking at pushes back violently against the mainstream narrative.
The narrative that Epstein was simply a wealthy, depraved financier who gamed the justice system.
Right. The core argument here is that Epstein was a highly sophisticated intelligence operative.
Yes.
The mechanics of his operation were entirely designed around blackmail and statecraft, with the analysis placing a heavy emphasis on ties to Israeli intelligence, among other agencies.
So let's look at the mechanics of blackmail as a geopolitical tool, because that's the real insight here.
Why does an intelligence agency care about compromising a tech CEO or a prominent politician at a private island?
Because it yields unprecedented leverage.
Yeah.
If you have video evidence of a billionaire who controls vital social media algorithms or defense contracting, you effectively control a piece of that infrastructure without ever having to pass a law or fire a bullet.
You own their influence.
You own it entirely. And the data point that the briefing hammers home is that of all the data seized from Epstein's properties, only about 2% has been released to the public.
Only 2%. That's crazy.
2%. And crucially, that 2% leaves out all the alleged video and audio surveillance.
Right, because Epstein's properties, not just the island, but townhouses in New York and mansions across the globe, were allegedly wired from top to bottom.
The implication of that unreleased data is completely radioactive.
What does it suggest?
It suggests that a significant portion of the people running the post-war consensus, economic leaders, politicians, scientific academics, are fundamentally compromised.
It shatters the illusion of a meritocracy. You realize the X-ray machine isn't just broken. The technicians have been actively tampering with the film for decades.
Exactly.
And this investigative source doesn't stop at Epstein. They dive deeply into the mechanics of domestic manipulation.
Specifically the concept of controlled opposition.
Right, controlled opposition. This is where the allegations bridge from international espionage to domestic political events.
Yes. The briefing targets organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC.
And the claim is pretty massive.
It is. The claim is that the SPLC and similar groups are involved in funding and managing controlled opposition cutouts.
They specifically analyze the tragic events in Charlottesville.
Right, arguing that certain extremist, far-right groups present there were actually seeded, funded, or subtly managed as dupes.
And the goal: to create a fraudulent, highly visible narrative of domestic terror.
Which could then be leveraged by political campaigns and media networks to justify crackdowns on civil liberties.
Now, obviously, these are explosive, highly contested allegations about recent American history.
Very controversial.
But as we're analyzing these sources, what we have to look at is the historical mechanism the source uses to validate this theory for their audience.
They don't just invent this idea out of thin air.
No, they point to the immediate aftermath of World War II.
They bring up Operation Gladio.
Yes, and I think we really need to unpack what Gladio was, because it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's a matter of historical public record.
Operation Gladio was a real, massive, covert operation, orchestrated by the CIA and NATO starting in the late 1940s.
Okay, how did it work?
The mechanism was what intelligence agencies call a stay-behind network. The fear was that the Soviet Union were going to roll tanks across Western Europe.
Right.
So the CIA essentially buried massive caches of weapons and explosives across countries like Italy and secretly trained paramilitary groups.
Basically prepping for an invasion.
Exactly. If the Soviets invaded, these groups were supposed to act as an armed resistance behind enemy lines.
But the Soviets never invaded.
Right.
So you have heavily armed, highly ideological, secret paramilitary groups operating in the shadows of European democracies with intelligence funding.
And this is where it goes dark. During the years of lead in Italy in the 70s and 80s, elements of these Gladio networks were implicated in false flag terrorism.
Wait, false flag terrorism?
Yes. Right-wing extremists would commit bombings, and the blame would be shifted to left-wing communist groups.
To manipulate Italian elections.
Exactly, to keep the country aligned with NATO.
The briefing cites a book called Game of Nations by Miles Copeland Wright, a former CIA operative.
He explicitly details the dupe mechanism.
Right. Intelligence agencies don't need to put their own agents in the street holding a sign. They just find an existing radical fringe group.
Secretly funnel them money or logistical support through, like, 3 layers of shell companies.
And let the extremists do the work. The extremists think they are fighting for their cause, completely unaware that their strings are being pulled by the very state they hate.
In order to achieve a broader geopolitical aim.
So, bringing this back to the present.
Right.
Regardless of the precise truth of every single claim made about Charlottesville or the specific identities on the Epstein flight logs,
The crucial sociological data point is that millions of people now firmly believe this is how the world
The
works.
benefit of the doubt is completely gone.
Gone. The post-war consensus relied on a baseline level of faith that the FBI, the media, and elected officials were, generally speaking, operating in the public interest. When a massive demographic assumes that institutions are actively managing domestic narratives via cutouts and blackmail, the entire social contract is shredded.
And when that paranoia bleeds down from the intelligence agencies into everyday life, you get the absolute chaos we are currently seeing in domestic politics.
Oh, absolutely.
The breakdown isn't just happening in the Persian Gulf or in CIA black sites. It is happening in our public schools and our voting booths.
The fracture manifests as radicalization on both ends of the spectrum. Let's look at the mechanics of how this is playing out on the political left, based on the undercover journalism in our briefing regarding the Chicago public school system.
The details here are incredibly intense.
Very intense.
The report alleges that taxpayer dollars are being leveraged by the school system to actively bus students out of their classrooms to participate in anti-government protests.
Specifically against ICE, immigration, and customs enforcement.
We're talking about footage of young teenagers holding signs that literally depict Donald Trump as Adolf Hitler. Furthermore, the curriculum itself is being weaponized. The source details ethnic studies units where students are explicitly taught, quote, what it is to not be a good person.
Based on an incredibly rigid, far-left ideological framework.
Right. And then we have a subsequent briefing that provides a right-wing sociological analysis of this exact footage.
And their takeaway is that the fundamental nature of the left has shifted.
Right. They argue that this isn't about traditional civic engagement. You know, the old liberal consensus was about expanding the pie.
Better health care, protecting civil rights, raising the minimum wage.
Exactly. But this analyst argues that the left has abandoned that framework entirely.
They view this footage as proof that the modern left's actual goal is demographic and ideological replacement.
They argue the public school system is being used as a mechanism to systematically indoctrinate the youth into a militant ideology.
Designed to permanently suppress conservative thought.
So if that is the perceived existential threat, how is the political right responding?
According to the sources we're reviewing, the established Republican response is fundamentally broken.
Broken. Yeah, we have a blistering, incredibly aggressive critique of the GOP establishment from a right-wing commentator here.
They don't just disagree with the GOP.
No, they view them with absolute contempt. They call the Republican Party completely useless.
The core of the critique is institutional paralysis.
The commentator lists very specific grievances where they believe the GOP fundamentally surrendered.
For instance,
They cite the failure to use hard political power to fight against unlimited abortion legislation in states like Virginia.
right.
They cite the failure to physically secure the border against mass immigration. And they cite the failure to prevent what they call the transing of children in medical and educational systems.
So the underlying mechanism they are critiquing is the psychology of the mainstream conservative politician.
Yeah, the argument is that the GOP establishment is completely terrified of the social stigma associated with the dying post-war consensus.
They are so afraid of being labeled woke or bigoted by the media class that they refuse to wield actual state-level power to protect their constituents.
Right. They would rather be viewed as polite, principled losers managing the decline of their civilization than as ruthless, effective defenders of it.
It's a harsh critique.
Very. Okay, let me offer an analogy here. It's like watching a failing corporation.
Okay, I like that.
The Democrats are the aggressive new management trying to radically alter the company's product line.
And the GOP.
The GOP establishment is the old board of directors sitting in the boardroom politely reading the bylaws while the building is on fire.
Completely ignoring what the shareholders actually want.
Exactly. And into that exact vacuum steps a hostile corporate takeover, Donald Trump.
That is a very apt way to describe the mechanics of Trump's political gravity. We have a fascinating analysis of a conversation between journalists Ross Douthat and Derek Thompson that unpacks exactly this dynamic.
They don't analyze Trump as a traditional politician with like a white paper policy platform.
No. They describe him as an entrepreneurial disruptor who realized the board of directors fundamentally misunderstood the market.
Trump tapped into a massive, completely unrepresented demand, what they call a barbarian energy.
And we should clarify the term barbarian in this context.
Yeah, please do.
It doesn't mean wearing pelts and sacking Rome. It means operating entirely outside the polite, established norms and language of the dying consensus.
Right. Think about what Trump allowed Republican voters to do. For decades, the GOP consensus was heavily tied to neoconservatism.
The idea that America should project military power globally, build nations, and intervene in the Middle East.
But Trump made it safe for regular blue-collar Republican voters to look at the Bush-era wars and say that was a catastrophic disaster.
He allowed them to critique the military-industrial complex without having to adopt the left-wing, anti-American framing of the anti-war movement.
He provided a chaotic, raw voice for a base that felt completely abandoned by the useless establishment.
However, the sources also highlight a massive structural illusion regarding how powerful this barbarian energy actually is in practice.
Yes, and this is a vital point about the physics of modern politics. This was my favorite insight in the entire stack.
The briefing points out the severe disconnect between digital influence and physical, real-world political mobilization.
Right. We see right-wing political podcasters or commentators who have audiences of millions
Millions of downloads, tens of thousands of retweets.
sitting in that digital ecosystem. It feels like they're at the vanguard of an unstoppable, massive cultural revolution.
But the mechanics of the internet do not map onto the mechanics of a voting booth.
Exactly. The internet creates massive, highly concentrated silos. The algorithm feeds you pure, distilled outrage.
And you surround yourself exclusively with voices that agree with you.
But those millions of podcast downloads are distributed globally. They do not equal millions of reliable, mobilized voters in a specific geographic district.
No. A podcaster might have more daily listeners than a cable news anchor.
But that doesn't mean they can organize a ground game that can actually win a precinct captain election in an Iowa caucus.
The online world runs on the physics of virality.
And the real world runs on the physics of geography and organization. They're two entirely different realities.
So let's pull back and look at the landscape we've mapped out here. The geopolitical order is breaking down into multipolarity and maritime conflict.
Right.
The public's trust in institutions and intelligence agencies has been replaced by a conviction that everything is controlled opposition.
Yeah.
Domestic politics has devolved into fears of ideological indoctrination, useless political establishments, and disruptive barbarian energy that struggles to translate digital outrage into physical power.
So when the horizontal world, the secular marketplace of ideas, the government, the schools, the economy, fails so completely to provide any sense of stability, justice, or meaning, what happens to the human psyche?
Where do people turn when the X-ray machine is broken and the map is burned?
They look up, or they look deep into the past. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most profound theme in our sources, the reemergence of deep religion.
Or what the sociological briefings are calling the return of verticality.
When the horizontal structures collapse, people naturally seek out ancient pre-political frameworks to anchor themselves. And what's wild is that we are seeing this happen in the most secular spaces imaginable.
Like the intellectual dark web.
Exactly. The briefings point to figures in these so-called intellectual dark web, guys like evolutionary biologist Brett Weinstein or Jordan Peterson.
Or even political commentators like Tucker Carlson.
These are individuals who operate almost entirely in a secular, materialist, or political space.
But the analysis observes a fascinating linguistic shift. When these thinkers are pressed to define the absolute bedrock of their worldview, the things they believe must be defended at all costs, the language of secular liberalism completely fails them.
Yes. They stop talking about rights or utility. They are forced to start using religious terminology.
They use words like sacred or demonic or existential or holy.
This represents a profound civilizational pivot. The entire project of the modern era was to crown science and rationality as the absolute queens of society.
The belief was that the scientific method and secular humanism could answer all human needs, construct a perfect moral order, and relegate religion to a private weekend hobby.
But the argument across these sources is that the project failed. Science can tell you how to split the atom.
But it cannot tell you why it's morally wrong to drop it on a city.
Exactly. It led us into a postmodern era where every truth claim is deconstructed, nothing has inherent value, and everything feels terrifyingly arbitrary.
So people are realizing that religion is not just an app on your phone that you open on Sunday mornings.
Religion is the foundational operating system of reality.
It is the metaphysical framework that gives meaning to the science, bounds the politics, and defines the morality. And this hunger for an unyielding operating system is driving what the sources call the orthodox moment in the West.
We are seeing a statistically significant wave of people, particularly disillusioned, politically homeless young men converting to Eastern Orthodoxy.
And the sources dive deeply into the mechanics of why they are choosing Orthodoxy over Roman Catholicism. Because for a long time in the West, if you wanted an ancient, traditional alternative to the modern secular world, you went Catholic.
But these new seekers perceive what the briefing calls system-level defeaters within the modern Catholic Church.
Right, let's unpack that. They're looking for immutability.
They want a rock that does not move when the cultural wind blows.
Exactly. The briefing points out that recent actions by the Vatican are viewed as fatal compromises with the post-war secular consensus.
For example, they cite recent changes to the Catechism regarding the death penalty, arguing it contradicts centuries of historical teaching.
But even more critically, they point to the Vatican's push for ecumenism.
Ecumenism being the effort to promote unity among the world's religions.
Specifically, the papal assertions that Muslims, Christians, and Jews ultimately worship the exact same God.
Now, to a secular person, that sounds like a lovely, tolerant, modern sentiment.
But to a young man seeking an unyielding, exclusive, ancient truth to anchor his life against the chaos of the modern world, that level of theological blending is a massive red flag.
It looks like the church is trying to appease the secular UN rather than defending a divine revelation.
Which is why they look to the East. Eastern Orthodoxy, with its decentralized conciliar structure, is perceived as being highly resistant to modernizing trends.
But this raises a massive tension. If you adopt a deep ancient religion as your primary operating system, how do you interact with the modern nation-state?
Right. This brings us to the perspective of Father Josiah Trenum, an Eastern Orthodox priest whose writings are featured in our stack.
He addresses the exact friction between patriotism, loving your country, and having ultimate loyalty to the kingdom of God.
It is the ultimate test of allegiances. Who gets your final obedience?
Father Trenum is incredibly blunt. He criticizes a nameless American politician who publicly stated that being an American was the highest honor of his life.
Trenum argues that from a theological perspective, this is a spiritually blinding and deeply dangerous mindset.
Think about the mechanics of that belief. If your ultimate highest loyalty is to the United States or Russia or any nation-state, you are fundamentally unable to subject that nation's actions to an objective, external moral standard.
You will justify any war, any drone strike, any intelligence operation because the state has effectively become your god.
But Trenum is careful to thread the needle here. He is not advocating for anarchism or a hatred of your homeland.
Not at all. And the historical analogy he uses is perfect.
He points out that the history of the ancient church is filled with true saints who were exceptional soldiers and deep patriots. He specifically highlights St. George.
St. George was a high-ranking, decorated soldier in the Roman Empire.
He served his country bravely, but he became a saint precisely because he understood exactly where to draw the line.
The mechanism of martyrdom.
Yes. When the Emperor Diocletian, when the state demanded absolute supremacy over God and ordered the systematic persecution of Christians, St. George refused to comply.
He loved Rome, but his highest loyalty was to the kingdom of God.
He drew the line, and he was executed for it. That is the model Trenum is elevating. Be a patriot, but never let the state become an idol.
And Trenum offers a fascinating path forward for Westerners who might feel a bit culturally alienated by the Eastern aesthetics of Orthodoxy.
We have to remember the Great Schism of 1054, where the Christian church split into the Catholic West and the Orthodox East over issues of papal authority.
Right, Trenum says you don't have to adopt Russian or Greek culture to find this deep verticality.
He encourages Westerners to look back to the ancient roots of their own ancestral lands prior to the schism.
He points to figures like Edward the Confessor, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England.
Edward represents a deeply Christian, pre-modern Western identity. Trenum is arguing that you can find a grounded spiritual history that predates the modern chaos without having to abandon your Western heritage.
It is the ultimate search for permanence in an era defined by terrifying fluidity.
Okay, let's try to pull all the threads of this massive deep dive together.
It's been a long journey.
It really has. We started by looking at a broken world. The neat, engineered maps of the post-war secular consensus are burning.
And we've traced the mechanics of that fire across every level of human society.
We saw it on the physical global stage, where the U.S. Navy is bleeding resources to stop Iranian fast boats from rewriting the rules of international trade in the Strait of Hormuz.
We saw the philosophical architects of the chaos, like Alexander Dugin, attempting to use distorted traditionalism to shatter the globe into multipolar civilizational islands.
We dove beneath the surface and saw how the public's faith in institutions has been annihilated by the realization that intelligence agencies utilize blackmail networks like Epstein's and manage domestic narratives through controlled opposition cutouts.
We watched that paranoia bleed into domestic politics, where public schools are accused of radicalizing teenagers, the Republican establishment is paralyzed by politeness, and Donald Trump launched a hostile corporate takeover fueled by an unrepresented barbarian energy.
And finally, we saw the human spirit's reaction to all this horizontal chaos, a desperate return to verticality.
A rejection of secular materialism in favor of the deep, uncompromising operating systems of ancient theology, where the kingdom of God supersedes the demands of the failing nation-state.
The old rules are gone. We are transitioning into a highly volatile, radically multipolar, and intensely spiritual era.
And that leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought to chew on for today.
We have spent this entire hour discussing the mechanics of power, military blockades, intelligence leverage, hostile political takeovers, and the battle for civilizational dominance.
Every actor we've discussed is obsessed with winning.
But one of our deep theological sources brings up a completely counterintuitive metric for validation, drawing on the biblical book of Job and, surprisingly enough, the 2001 Heath Ledger movie, A Knight's Tale.
Wait, Heath Ledger jousting to a Queen soundtrack. How does that fit into geopolitical theology?
Right. It's all about the mechanics and proving devotion. In the movie, the young knight wants to prove his profound love to the princess.
His instinct is to do what everyone in our breaching stack is doing. He wants to dominate.
He wants to win the tournament, crush his opponents, and offer her the victory.
But the princess tells him that winning proves absolutely nothing. Everyone wants to win because winning brings glory to the victor.
She tells him, if you really love me, you must lose.
You must willingly endure the humiliation and suffering of defeat to prove that your devotion is to her, and not just a selfish pursuit of power and ego.
Man, that completely flips the script.
And if we look at the book of Job, Job is stripped of all his earthly power, wealth, and health.
And when he demands an explanation from God, when he demands that neat, engineered, horizontal map of why things happen, he doesn't get one.
He is simply given an encounter with the terrifying, awe-inspiring reality of the divine, which humbles him completely.
He doesn't get a policy paper, he gets a paradigm shift.
Exactly. So as you watch these massive worldviews clash in the coming years, whether it's the U.S. enforcing hegemony, Dugin pushing multipolarity, activists marching in the streets, or young men returning to ancient altars, it raises a profound question.
What if the ultimate test of these emerging frameworks isn't found in how effectively they conquer their enemies, control the shipping lanes, or dominate the ballot box?
What if the true validity of a worldview is found in how it helps a human being make sense of suffering, sacrifice, and defeat?
Because when the institutions fail, when the intelligence agencies are compromised, and when the map is finally burned away, the only thing you have left to measure is the depth of the soul.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.